So this morning, we're going to hear from Nick Green from Fatgreen Consulting. Now, Nick has a wealth of experience of living and doing business in China, and he's going to share with us his knowledge of the market potential and how to tackle the language and cultural challenges that businesses face. And without further ado, Nick, I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much for that, and good morning to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, and I do see some familiar faces, I am one of the founding partners of Fatgreen Consulting based here in Yorkshire. I'd like to start by welcoming you all to this morning's presentation, and just to say that I hope you will find what I'm about to discuss of interest to you. Clearly, in a post-Brexit environment, UK PLC and UK government is encouraging business owners to engage beyond the boundaries of the EU. China is one such target, but without experience of China, the question I think on many people's lips is how can Yorkshire business leaders approach China, and what are some of the pitfalls? And those really, as Michelle identified, are the key things that I want to address in this presentation. So moving on to my first slide, just a very brief introduction. Our partners, two of our partners have significant experience in North Asia. I myself on the top, I lived in Hong Kong for 18 years. Annie Lian, lady on the right, grew up in China in a city called Fuzhou, but then subsequently lived and studied and worked in San Francisco and Hong Kong. The chap at the bottom, Peter Blacklock, is our non-exec director. So that's just a very brief introduction in terms of who we are. For many years, government and the press have spoken about China and the opportunity it presents to UK PLC. But really the question on many people's lips is, what does that opportunity actually look like? One of the challenges for people in the West, I think, and certainly this is something I experienced in my own time when I first moved to Hong Kong, was understanding the scale of China and appreciating that it's actually quite difficult for many Westerners to get their head around because the numbers involved are just so great. But let me share with you some very basic facts. China has the world's largest population of 1.44 billion people. It's the second largest global economy, worth $12.2 trillion. China has currently more than 10 cities in excess of 10 million people. And 700 million people of its population are defined by middle class or middle income groups. And to try and put that into perspective, I often find it useful to consider that the population of the European Union is 446 million. So 700 million of China's population are what we define as middle class, and that is approximately just under half of their population. So that gives you some sense of the scale and the dimension in China. In terms of its economy, China is clearly the fastest growing economy in the world. And actually most economists predict that the Chinese economy is expected to overtake the US and become the largest economy in the world by 2030. In line with that growth, China has also witnessed a massive increase in consumer spending. And you can see clearly from that graph on the bottom just how Chinese consumer spending habits are set to grow over the next few years. But of course, the big question is, how has China achieved this? In part, a large part of China's rapid economic growth is due to economic restructuring. What we've seen in the past 30 years is a transformation of the Chinese economy. And typically that has moved or transformed from a predominantly agrarian-based society with low margin manufacturing, which has been export-led, towards an urbanized economy, which is very much based upon an innovation economy. At the same time, there has been a massive emphasis on raising people's standards of living. And that today, the net result of these economic policies and economic restructuring is a growing middle class with a very, very strong internal demand. So the combination of urbanization, an innovation-based economy, and a growing middle class is effectively what is shaping the modern China which we see today. And supporting that growth, obviously you'd expect certain industries to be taking a dominant lead, which are clearly highlighted on this slide. However, the demand for tech, digital, high-tech touch businesses is significantly unprecedented. So businesses, for example, focusing on internet services, online gaming, online games, online shopping, renewable energies, and biotech and pharmaceutical are really driving China's growth very, very rapidly now. And effectively, these changes we're seeing both in terms of the structure of the economy, industry, and the growing middle class are what's helping to forge what we now see as a modern China. But the question, I guess, on many people's lips is what does a modern China actually look like? And I think the next slide really, from my mind, summarizes the pace of change and also the modernization which China's gone through. Clearly, what we can see here, often referred to as the Paris of the Orient, is Shanghai. Now, Shanghai for me is a beautiful city, and I must admit that I fell in love with Shanghai from the very first moment I met it. Sorry, from the very first moment I went to it. But clearly, what you can see here is Shanghai taken off from the Bund, looking across to Puxi in 1987. Within 26 years, that same piece of land opposite the Bund had been completely and utterly transformed. And having been through Puxi, which is the modern metropolis, you can see, it's like being in any modern city in the world. It really is quite a stunning city, and it's the rate of development. It's mind-blowing how quickly it's developing. And something I just really want to, I suppose, highlight here as well is that this is just one city. This is Shanghai, but the story doesn't end there. You know, we see a similar story in places like Shenzhen, which are just north of the border of Hong Kong, Hangzhou, Nanjing, many other Chinese cities have gone through a similar level of transformation where once, in many respects, you know, once there was, certainly in the case of Shenzhen, farming land, what you now see 30, 40 years later are stunning modern cities. And that to me just summarizes the pace for which China is developing at the moment. A few other points I would highlight in terms of what I experienced from living in Hong Kong, China, in terms of how I typify modern China. The same change and development is being replicated in the modern Chinese consumer. The days of people wearing Chairman Mao suits are long gone. And what has replaced those is modern fashions and Western brands. So in most major Chinese cities you go to today, you will see huge Louis Vuitton shops, Nike, Hermes, Levi's, you know, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, Audi, BMWs. Most of the West's top tier brands all have significant shops and retail coverage in China, such is the demand for Western goods. And with that, it probably comes as no surprise to learn that a lot of the European car manufacturers, such as Rolls-Royce and BMW and Audi, actually a lot of their cars have been tailored specifically to meet the requirements of some of the Chinese market. So, for example, you know, the 7 Series, BMW, the Audi A8, all of these cars are offered in a long wheelbase version, simply because Chinese people prefer to be driven rather than to drive themselves. So against this backdrop, you know, of increasing urbanization, of a restructuring in the economy, of huge demand for Western goods, the question really, I guess, for many people here in Yorkshire is, well, how can I capitalize on this? You know, how can my business get a piece of that action? And that, to a certain extent, can be a challenge. But like many things in life, I'm a great believer that it's not necessarily what you know, but who you know. And against these cultural language barriers, the challenge is where to start. Now, a very good place to start is international bodies. The chambers of commerce are a fantastic starting point. I know Matthew's going to speak about this shortly, but clearly the chambers of commerce have very, very strong links with their international bodies, such as the Shanghai and the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce. I regularly interacted with the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce and the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce, and I can confirm that both of them are excellent organizations and both have very, very strong links into the business community, both with businesses as well as professional services firms. China British Business Council, again, the China British Business Council is there to help promote opportunities and foster strong relationships between Chinese business and UK business. But again, just like the Chambers of Commerce, the China British Business Council is an excellent source of information for people. The Department of International Trade, when I was in Hong Kong, the Department of International Trade put on a very, very large, very high profile and successful trade show in Hong Kong Harbour, where a number of dignitaries and senior business leaders were brought from the UK to Hong Kong to meet with their equivalents in China. So the Department of International Trade is an excellent source of relationships and just general know-how and knowledge in what it's like to do business in China. The British Consulate General in Hong Kong, although it has a slightly different mandate from the others, it still has fairly broad links into the business community. And finally, I would say one mustn't underestimate the links and relationships that multinational companies have. I know one of the members of this panel, one of the guests at this presentation, worked for a very high-profile international investment bank whilst he was in Hong Kong, and it comes to no surprise that firms like Ernst & Young, Barclays, Rothschild, etc., all have very, very strong relationships with offices and people with boots on the ground in China. So despite China's size and the cultural language barriers, there are, as you can see from this, there are a number of very well-established organizations, both government and business, who can help you along your journey. And I would strongly recommend it's worth reaching out to these before you embark on a trip to China. This brings me on to my next slide of what are the best ways to access the China market. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I have no legal training, so I'm not here to provide legal insights, but assuming your business is committed to exploring opportunities in China, the next question is, well, what is the best type of framework that you might consider? There are a number of different ways, as you can see from the slide, which provide access to people to China, and with that, those different business structures afford a different level of control. But certainly, one route for companies who are manufacturing here and perhaps want to export into China is to look at setting up distributor agreements. Many companies seek to set up a representative office in China. A WOFE is another very successful route for a lot of people. And then finally, it's not uncommon for businesses to look to set up joint ventures with a locally registered company. So those are just a number of the four most common ways to establishing a presence in China that we come across. Again, with any country comes regulations, and China is not unique. Regulatory requirements seem to be omnipresent in every country across the world. In China, regulatory approval is typically achieved by obtaining a series of red chops, which you can see on the slide in front of you. And these tend to be issued by layers of different authorities. That can be challenging sometimes. And I know, certainly from talking to Annie and others who are mainland Chinese, sometimes navigating your way through different regulatory bodies can be quite a challenge, as can be protecting things like intellectual property rights and trademarks, and keeping abreast of regulatory changes. But I guess while some of this might seem daunting, I often fall back on the phrase, "If you seek, ye shall find." I believe that phrase still rings true today. And as you can see from the slides before this, there are some excellent bodies with relationships in the business community, such as the Chambers of Commerce, who can point you in the right direction, introduce you to regulators or lawyers on the ground in China who can help you navigate your way through this. So Whilst it may seem somewhat daunting, remember there are always people around you who are very, very happy to help. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in business is selecting the right partner. I firmly believe, when I look back through my career, that people buy from who they relate to. And based on my experience of international business, people's heritage, whether they're Chinese or British, is never a barrier, because in all societies there are people who share similar philosophies or have similar perspectives and outlooks on life. But for the uninitiated, misinterpretation of these values and the way that people communicate can be very, very costly. And this is what I want to now move on to. As many of you probably know, Asia is loosely underpinned by Confucian values. Confucius lived from 551 BC to 479 BC. And I think it's fair to say that Confucius is probably considered the paragon of the Chinese sages. Among many of Confucius's values was the promotion of etiquette and respect for elders. Today, Confucian values are typified as goodness, benevolence, harmony, and respect for tradition. And you'll find when you do business in China that these same Confucius values still dominate the business environment. So one thing I would strongly stress is that showing an appreciation of these values is extremely important when engaging in the Chinese business environment. Sadly, misinterpretation of these values and the associated body language can and frequently does result in unsuccessful or failed business ventures. In particular, there are two values which are absolutely paramount in China, and that's the importance of giving face as well as respect for the hierarchy. These two values should not be underestimated. I'm just going to touch very briefly on both of these values. Giving face in China is a key business practice. Giving face comes from Confucian ideals, where partners must strive for harmony. And in effect, giving face is effectively showing respect to others. If you make someone look good in a business environment by giving them face, it reflects very well on your counterpart, but it also reflects very well on yourself. And by giving face to another, by listening and responding positively, effectively shows that you care and that you take them seriously and you have respect for that individual. Conversely, if you lose face through perhaps some kind of event or an expectation which is not met, or where someone has been indelicate, the consequences of losing face can be equally dramatic. Losing face in China, this cannot be underestimated enough, actually. Losing face in China is extremely humiliating, and it will make or break friendships, no matter how good the business opportunity is. So if in China, please bear in mind the importance of giving face or showing respect to your business partners. Of equal importance is Junzi. Junzi is effectively hierarchical respect. Again, it's born out of Confucius values, where Confucius places the family unit right at the center of many of his values. But in that, there's a very clear hierarchy where children are expected to obey their parents and show respect for the hierarchy and their parents. So again, acknowledging respect for the hierarchy is also expected in the business community. And I can share with you one very real life example. There was a very famous senior China investment banker who I knew in Hong Kong. And he had quite a significant team around him of very senior investment bankers, but they all called him the general. And this is just one example. By calling him the general, it's showing respect to his hierarchy and his authority. But it is a very, very important. The 2 points of giving face and showing hierarchical respect are very, very important in China. It should never, ever be underestimated. So with that, we can see how important cultural sensitivities are. And it is important to bear these in mind, because sometimes the way that we say no and the way that Chinese businesses know are very, very different. And unless you show appreciation for that and listen, and seem to be listening to what people are saying, it really does, in many cases, mean the difference between making or breaking a business transaction. So please, if you do go to China, bear these cultural sensitivities in mind. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in China, and not just in China actually, but in many societies, is being able to identify who the decision makers are. And I'm afraid, unless you can identify who the decision maker is, the danger is people go with good intentions to China to explore business opportunities. They meet the wrong person, or they meet probably someone who's 2 or 3 layers down from the decision maker. And typically what happens is you go through 6 or 7 or 8 rounds of meetings and dinners, hoping for and expecting a positive outcome as a result of talking to these people, only to then find that the deal process just grinds to a halt. And this again is, it's frustrating because it wastes a lot of time. But again, what it's ultimately reflecting is the fact it goes back to the Confucian values of hierarchy. You have to make sure that you're talking to the decision maker. If you identify the decision maker, you tend to find that actually getting a decision out of them is actually relatively straightforward, and it can often result in a successful outcome. But failure to find the right decision maker is very difficult. Now, with that in mind, clearly dealing with privately owned businesses in China is a lot more straightforward than dealing with state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises have many, many different layers of management. There are often political considerations to be taken into fact, which can make things a very complicated process. Whereas in contrast, just as it is in this country, if you're dealing with private owners or private businesses, it's much easier to go direct to the horse's mouth. But please do bear that in mind when you are engaging with China. Another consideration I would just flag with you, which perhaps is not as obvious, is a geographic bearing. What we can see from this map, highlighted in blue, is the proportion of GDP per head. And what we tend to find is the port cities on the east coast of China have the highest GDP rankings. I'd also go further than that and say that when you go to these cities, such as Shanghai or Fuzhou or Guangdong, these cities on the eastern coast of China tend to have a more international feel about them, whereas the further you go into the hinterland, you notice a very, very different feel and culture within China. And I think the other thing I would highlight as well, and this goes back to my point really about identifying decision makers and getting to the right people. It's very common when you go to places like Fuzhou or Shanghai or Zhejiang that you'll meet people like Annie, who's one of our founders, who are mainland Chinese by heritage, but may well have studied overseas, worked in San Francisco, and then Hong Kong, as Annie did. So you find that the eastern border cities tend to have a more international flavour to them. You find a lot more people there who've got international exposure and effectively speak the same language of business as you or I do. And I think that's a really important cultural point to highlight because, as I said earlier, in my experience, people do business with who they can relate to. Finding people who have got that international dimension and probably speak exceptionally good English is again underpins the importance of being able to work with people who have a similar outlook on life to yourselves, which ultimately just reduces the potential for things to be misinterpreted or to go wrong. So I place enormous emphasis on understanding the culture in China, the nuances around giving face and respect to hierarchy. I place enormous amount of emphasis on identifying the decision maker, and then further to that, I cannot underestimate the importance of identifying business partners who have that international dimension, because you will find that they understand you much more clearly and vice versa, hopefully resulting in a much more positive outcome. The final thing I just want to dwell on in this section is the importance of business relationships. Never ever underestimate the power of business relationships in China. As with Yorkshire, where everyone seems to know everybody, Chinese business leaders tend to deal with people who they know or they've been introduced to by a trusted partner. And because of this, Chinese business leaders place enormous emphasis on getting to know their business partners. So if you do find yourself in China, looking to do business in China, and maybe you've had a couple of positive meetings, do expect to be invited to a dinner. And just as President Nixon found out, you will expect those dinners to be alcohol-fueled. Also, I would suggest that bear in mind that China has many types of Chinese cuisine. I have to warn you or tell you that the type of Chinese food you get from Chinese restaurants and Chinese takeaways in the UK has been tailored towards our tastes. So do expect to eat chicken feet, do expect to eat sea blubber, and do expect to be served ox intestine. And these are just some of many delicacies which get served at the Chinese dinner table. It is considered not to rude, at least try when offered to do so. So please bear that in mind. And finally, I would say just be warned. As I mentioned, it's very common for Chinese to drink at dinners, and typically the alcohol of choice is baijiu, which is a rice-based alcohol. Typically, baijiu is drunk in shot glasses, and it's normally down in one. And as the meeting starts to flow, the dinner starts to flow, the amount of baijiu also starts to flow as well. But I warn you just in advance this, because baijiu is incredibly strong. It can, in some respects, be up to 70%, and it's not uncommon for people to fall off their chairs and land on the heap on the floor at Chinese dinners. But if you find yourself in that situation, I'd say enjoy it, because it's normally a sign that things are going very well. So with that in mind, I leave you with one final thought. The Chinese have a very famous proverb, which is a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And that single step ultimately is down to us. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you to Michelle and Justine for helping us put this on.